Explained by the Billy Meier contacts. Mysteries, myths, legends, conspiracy theories, historical inaccuracies, and more. Compiled by David Chance, revised October 18, 2023.
Foo Fighters not see UFOs, see also UFOs, are flying saucers. Contact Report 031.
I have heard and read that our scientists are trying to make their own earthly beam ships. Is that true, and how advanced are these things?
This information is consistent with the truth to the extent that such flying apparatuses are in their infancy being built on Earth. However, they are not beam ships, but flying machines similar to our ships, equipped only with explosion engines or, more recently, with jet engines with recoil effect. The construction of such ships on Earth in modern times is not entirely new, however, for the first ships of this kind were completed in planning and construction as early as 1941. In mid-February 1945, the first flights were carried out up to altitudes of around 2,500 meters, developing speeds of just over 2,000 kilometers per hour. It was all commissioned by the Führer of the Second World War, Adolf Hitler. At the end of the war, however, everything was destroyed so that it would not fall into the hands of the enemy. Various plans and devices and apparatuses, however, were overlooked and fell into other hands. From these, various groups developed the disc-shaped ships of terrestrial origin that exist today. These flying discs, as they are called by the designers, naturally require their test flights to test their properties, etc. Many of these objects can therefore be observed by Earth humans as they are flown about to be flown in or tested. The largest of these terrestrial flying objects of this type already reach nearly 10 meters in diameter and are already quite numerous. Of course, this is quite vigorously denied by the governments of the states possessing them. However, their machines have often crashed because they are still rather poorly developed in all respects. But the uninitiated human beings of Earth live in the mistaken belief that these flying discs they observe are of the same kind as our beam ships and come from extraterrestrial worlds.
So that is how it is. Then several of the UFOs observed around the world are not UFOs at all, but simply terrestrial flying discs.
That is so, yes. Often they are also forced to make emergency landings because their constructions, devices, and apparatus are still very inadequate. Their explosion engines and jet engines, which they recently also want to operate atomically, but which are still wishes for the future, very often cause combustion damage. Human beings who come into the vicinity of such combustion fires are so often also threatened by dangers of atomic radiation, starting from experimental atomic reactors, which are supposed to serve for propulsion, but which will not succeed for a long time yet. If distressed ships of this kind are approached by observers, by which I mean that they go near them, then they are often frightened by the occupants or even abducted and deported in order to ensure their absolute silence. Such occurrences are unfortunately not uncommon on the Earth, but through the ignorance of human beings and various unreal Enlightenment striving groups, they are invariably attributed to extraterrestrial life forms. You may also be sure that no Earth human being has ever gone outside the Earth's moon orbit before you, Billy, in this century which is currently ruling you, apart from those abducted by human robbery and the female and male life forms who were shot into the moon's orbit by a rocket whose capsule control failed. However, and the capsule with the human beings drifted off into space, which, however, is concealed by those responsible. See Contact Report 6265 to 69 entry below.
Contact Report 044.
Another question about the persons you marked as negative. referring to the list of contactees presented in Contact Report 43, 13 to 55, or is it not possible with them, or at least with one or the other, that they had some kind of contact after all? That this is not known to you or to yours, and that these contacts have simply slipped through your fingers, so to speak?
That is absolutely impossible. The people I have marked as negative are not contact persons. In any case, they never had contact with extraterrestrial intelligences that reached them from outside of the Earth, neither through free space nor through a dimensional gate, because these penetration possibilities are so hermetically controlled that it is completely impossible for even a tiny particle unit to be able to pass through without being registered by us or the other intelligences monitoring the Earth. If, however, an intrusion into the earthly space takes place, then everything is very precisely monitored and registered. And these controls and registrations do not give any evidence that the negative persons mentioned could be positive. But I do not want to exclude the possibility of explaining to you that the persons I have described as negative may have been in connection with the intelligences of Giza, or may still be in connection with them, because we do not exercise precise control over them.
So this possibility remains open?
Sure, but the persons concerned would have been very badly misdirected. The same goes for those who have been deceived by earthly intelligences, namely by those who have the stolen beam ships of the Germans at their disposal and pretend to be extraterrestrials to earthly men.
Contact Report 050.
Are there alien bases under Caluert or Caluest, Texas, and under the mountains near Salzburg and in Lake Constance? Note: the Salzburg reference may be related to a case from June 7, 1954, reported in the book Flying Saucers Uncensored by Harold T. Wilkins, in which 3 German tourists went missing in the Lamprecht Cave near Lofer in the Salzburg mountain region of Austria. The Lake Constance reference may be related to reports of strange phenomenon in that area, later mentioned in such books as Best UFO Cases, Europe by Illobrand von Ludwiger, and Humanoid Encounters 1975 to 1979 by Albert S. Rosales.
None of the 3 places mentioned.
But it is said that extraterrestrials have a base there, especially under the mountains?
That is not so, however. All stations on the Earth are known to us. There is absolutely no doubt about that. So it is a certainty when I explain to you that there are no extraterrestrial bases, etc. underneath the mountain.
It has always been claimed that something of this form is there.
But that is not really the case. On the other hand, however, this may be connected with another station hidden there, namely that of a group of Earthlings who had secretly built a base there during the Second World War, deep in the cliffs where they could live and work. It was one of those groups that got their hands on plans by which they were able to produce beam ship-like flying objects.
You are referring to the German flying saucers?
Certainly. However, their ships are still quite primitive and not space-capable. So they are still earthbound, but here they have all kinds of possibilities. These Earth humans are also one of those groups that approach Earth humans and claim that they come from the stars with their saucer-shaped flying objects and are extraterrestrials. But this group is no longer in Europe, but like other groups in the South American region.
Contact Report 062.
Do you know anything about the Russians in the 50s or 60s shooting a space capsule into free space that was said to have been manned by 3 men and a woman? Is it also true, then, that the 4 people with their capsule got off course and shot out into space, presumably to end their lives there?
In the 1950s, a disk was shot from a private station into free space, which was occupied by 4 people. They were a woman and 3 men of Russian origin. The originators of this enterprise were one of the groups that, after the Second World War, had seized the plans of the flying discs in Germany and set up their own organization. We inexplicably leaked some data about these events, which Karl and Annie Veit in Wiesbaden in particular twisted and falsified, claiming that the disc was a Russian space capsule.
To my knowledge, it was said that 2 Italian radio amateurs intercepted signals from this spaceship, or whatever it was.
That is completely impossible, because the total destruction of the voice and radio signal traffic, as well as that of the command functions of the ship, were to blame for the fact that the ship got off course and drifted into free space.
Contact Report 065.
Almost abruptly, it came to pass that at various points on Earth there were stations of those elements and private circles of interest that seized the plans of the flying discs at the end of the last World War, namely in Germany and Canada. These elements, however, which have built stations in inaccessible places for the Earth humans and have developed quite airworthy devices there from the stolen plans, now feel extremely endangered by the investigations of certain countries, and they fear that you could give exact information about their existence and the coordinates of their stations if you were to be questioned by any secret services involved in these investigations. That would mean that armies could be set in motion to destroy the stations and get hold of all the achievements. But to prevent such a step, a special group in Brazil is trying to shut you out and to push you out of this world. This is a group of fanatics led by a man from Germany called Dunneberg. Note, see Men in Black.
Contact Report 066.
The 2 other attacks were carried out by a Nazi group that had settled in Brazil after the end of the war. Note, see Men in Black. They robbed German and Canadian plans for the construction of flying discs with which they are able to fly almost effortlessly into the earthly space today. They also came into the possession of a foreign spacecraft of a human race from a distant galaxy. The interstellar drive, however, was destroyed beyond recognition, so they could only use the anti-gravity drive for planetary flight. With this ship, which offered them many possibilities, they also tracked you. It was the same ship that you recently tracked down in Winkelried near Wetzikon, but which had landed there weeks before when you found the mysterious tracks. The crew of the ship that had used the aircraft to fly to the Earth is dead. They all died after their breathing apparatus became empty and could not be refilled. They were poison gas respirators, a gas that is still unknown on the Earth. Over time, their ship, in the hands of the Nazis, could have had dire consequences for the Earth humans, which is why we were forced to destroy it completely when they left it unattended for a few moments.
Contact Report 231.
Well, there are always questions about the flying discs that were secretly constructed in Germany before the Second World War, and also during the war. I could observe flight attempts of such discs together with Svath during the war still before the middle of the 40s over Germany, whereby he explained to me some. Ta also spoke of it. It was on the Great Journey that the flight tests sometimes brought very valuable results, and flights were carried out up to altitudes of around 12,500 meters. The engines were first explosion engines and later jet engines. In 1941, Svath and Ptah said the planning had been completed and the construction of the flying discs had been tackled. Look here. In this contact report, the following is written, which Ptah explained.
New, however, because the first ships of this kind were already completed in 1941 in the planning stage and beginning to be built. In mid-February 1945, the first flights were carried out to altitudes of around 12,500 meters, at which speeds of slightly more than 2,000 kilometers per hour were developed. Everything was commissioned by the leader of the Second World War, Adolf Hitler. At the end of the war, however, everything was destroyed so as not to fall into the hands of the enemy. But various plans and equipment were overlooked and fell into other hands. From this, different groups developed the presently existing ships of disc-shaped kind and earthly origin. These flying discs, as they were called by the constructors, of course needed their test flights in order to test their characteristics, etc. Many of these objects can therefore be observed by terrestrial humans when they are flown around to fly them and test them. The largest of these earthly missiles of this kind already reach nearly 100 meters in diameter and are already quite numerously represented. Of course, this is vigorously denied by the governments of the states owning them. But their machines have often crashed because they are poorly developed. But the uninitiated human beings of the Earth live in the erroneous belief that these flying discs observed by them are the same as our beam ships and come from extraterrestrial worlds. Now, however, claims are being made again and again which, according to what Svath and Ptah have explained, have no basis whatsoever because most of it is based only on wild fantasies and speculations, which probably serves to make a profit. For example, the crazy story that the Germans flew to Mars with their flying discs. Can you say something more about this?
Some things are known to me, which is why I can say that the disc aircraft of that time, which were already planned very early, that is to say from the 20s onwards, and later constructed, were developments that were considered miracle aircraft. This was because they were so-called single-wing aircraft. However, these flying discs or single-wing aircraft were nothing more than airplanes, even if they were of a completely different type than the normal wing aircraft. So they were not extraterrestrial or esoteric marvels, in which alleged extraterrestrials or people of other dimensions, etc., participated, as has been claimed to be, for some time, by lying and deceitful profit-obsessed ones, as well as by self-proclaimed false experts, contact persons, esotericists, and parapsychologists, by those who want to be great, by self-obsessed people, and by patients afflicted with inferiority complexes. The truth concerning the flying discs is simple and lies beyond all delusions, fantasies, and all erroneous assertions and stupid ideas. The fact is that not only in Germany since the 20s, there have been projects concerning the planning and development of flying discs, but also in Russia, England, and America. At the same time, America, Germany, England, and Russia were already planning to conquer the moon and the entire solar system with regard to aircraft suitable for space travel. Everything happened, however, under strictest secrecy, as I already said. When at the end of the war, the Americans and Englishmen illegally appropriated large parts of the German flying disc technology, which was already very advanced, the war winners had won. So it became just 1 year later when the British and the Americans tested the captured technology together in Canada, as well as the Americans also in their own country, and with success. Since then, progress has not stopped, so that many different types of flying discs have been developed, which can be seen again and again when they are on test or spy flights. Ultimately, all this technology should serve to monitor the entire Earth, as should be the case with humans themselves, who should be subjected to total surveillance by implanted control chips. Such plans already exist in secret, whereby in Europe the European Union, which is already on its way, will be the authoritative dictatorship. The flying disc technology, however, when I want to come back to it, is also integrated into space technology, because for a long time there have been efforts to construct the flying discs in such a form that they can be used to travel around space and reach other planets, which are Earth-like in shape and inseminated. These newly developed flying discs have been leading to UFO sightings all over the world for quite some time now, and then it has been deliberately mistakenly claimed by a wide variety of sources that these are aircraft of extraterrestrial origin. So it is a fact that since 1945, when the plans of the air disc technology fell into the hands of the Americans, Russians and English, with few exceptions, the whole earthly humankind is lied to and deceived, and for this every means is justified, also alleged activities of extraterrestrials. And all those fools, irresponsible, criminals, deceivers, liars and swindlers, etc., in matters of alleged contacts with extraterrestrials, spirits, dead and higher beings are co-responsible for the fact that the secret machinations can be promoted in relation to the flying discs, because with their lies and deceits, they promote everything still. So they help those who have been lying to and cheating on humankind since 1945, who can secretly make enormous technical achievements on the flying discs and realize their secret projects in order to control and subjugate all of humankind and the planet to totality. And all this is financed with huge sums of money stolen from people with unjust tax money. But back to the flying discs in Nazi Germany. The single-winged flying discs of all kinds of the Nazi era were as purely of earthly origin as they still are today, since they are technically very much further developed and can often be observed. In fact, however, they are nothing more than terrestrial airplanes. In Nazi Germany, too, the planning and construction of flying discs was also a strictly secret military project, but under the leadership of Adolf Hitler. These projects involved many distinguished scientists, such as a certain Beluzzo, a Meier, an Epp, and a Schriever, to name but a few. Note: this is likely referring to Giuseppe Beluzzo, Richard Meier, Joseph Epp, and Rudolf Schriever. At that time, the technology of the single-wing flying discs was a completely new technology, which had very futuristic forms and was preserved until today. Nevertheless, this whole development was and is based on the terrestrial normal aeronautical technology, so that no extraterrestrial or other dimensioned flying technique or propulsion technology comes into effect. So neither anti-gravitational drives played a role or could be used, nor any converter devices, which allegedly originated from extraterrestrials or other dimensions, because in fact they are all only wild and nonsensical, imaginative, or quite consciously lying and fraudulent claims. The same applies to claims that the Germans flew to Mars or even to distant galaxies with their flying discs. Truthfully, first the engines were explosion engines, and later radiation and rocket engines, which in turn were improved later by air combustion catalytic converters. The aim was to suck the air from the wing of the flying disc, to liquefy it quickly by cooling it down, after which it was burned catalytically and thus served as propulsion energy, which was ejected by rotating nozzles on the outer ring of the flying disc in a fogging manner, whereby the missile was seen only blurred.
Contact Report 254.
We already worked with those flying devices, which you call the cake ship, in the 20s, but it was indeed only at the end of the 70s that they were brought to the required status for their use on the Earth. The form of these flying devices was specially thought up for the Earth, for which reason we made the effort to transmit the entire necessary specifications for the design to terrestrial scientists through impulse telepathy so that, out of that, flying discs could be developed. This impulse telepathic information went predominantly to aerospace technicians. as I will designate these persons, whereby especially German engineers were included for this, to whom we transmitted exact plans for the external form, as well as certain technical particulars which were responsible to transmit. Thereby the German scientists also actually experimented, whereby they could construct halfway suitable flying discs, which according to our thinking at those times should have been used to constitute an air power through which an early brought-about world peace should have been achieved. However, the political machinations changed very quickly into a bellicose direction, for which reason we brought an end to further impulse telepathic information to the German scientists and allowed the project to expire, whereby we, however, initially transmitted false information so that the flying discs could not be created specifically for warlike purposes. However, the plans existed furthermore in isolated copies because we could not obtain them all. Which was, however, no longer bad, because these still existing papers were extremely incomplete and disappeared in this form. In practice, these drafts were only available as sketches, which only showed the outer ring and the underside of the flying device, while the extension underneath and the construction of the top were no longer available. And it is exactly these sketches of the outer ring as well as its underside, which survived for several decades and reappeared in the middle of the 60s. Though this happened without our knowledge, because since the disappearance of the sketches which had become useless, we concerned ourselves no further about that until just now, when you called Florina and communicated to her that you discovered that the forms of lids for large containers exist, which in their configuration and construction are made exactly the same as the lower ring and its underside of our flying device, and show the same structure more than only approximately. And because you gave one of these kinds of lids to Florina in order to provide clarification, it was easy for us to compare it with the construction of the flying device, which made the astonishing sameness clear to us, which also gave us occasion to dedicate our attention to the matter. Therefore we cleared everything up very precisely, and thereby found out that the sketches which surfaced again were evaluated in industrial firms and found application, and that these same sketches were utilized for the design and manufacture of forms of lids which were completely atypical, because until then, the designers usually only ever drafted forms of lids which showed simple lines. However, never forms which could be called futuristic and complicated. Thus came about the form of the lids for the container named by you, whereby the form of the lids, as I already said, is deceptively similar to the area of the lower ring and its underside, as is shown by our flying devices which relate to this.
But say, dear friend, because of the flying discs of the Germans, one hears strange things again and again. Is it true that flight tests were actually carried out, with the discs reaching Mars at an altitude of 12,000 meters?
Such assertions are absurd, because the flight-spinning tops, as they were really called, did not find such perfection in Germany, and the fact that flights into space should have taken place with them corresponds to an imagination. On the other hand, flying discs were later built in other countries, for example, in South America. In the former Soviet Union and in America, too, efforts were made to build such aircraft after the occupying forces of Germany had received the corresponding construction plans, which were so incomplete that the new plan owners themselves had to do a great deal of work and contribute so that the flying discs could be built, but which could also only be used for terrestrial airspace, as is still the case with these aircraft today, apart from a certain group in South America, as you know.
Can you still tell me whether the construction plans for the flying discs seized by the occupying powers were the same kind that you impulse telepathically transmitted to the Germans, and who was actually responsible for them?
You mean those plans from which the covers were finally made?
Exactly.
The transmissions went to two men named Schriever and Meier, who also dealt with self-constructed plans for flying gyroscopes. It was these plans that fell into the hands of the Americans and the Soviets, who then devoted themselves to their studies and constructions. Also, the group in South America came into the possession of copies of the same flying gyroscopes, namely by theft.
Surely one may say that this group was higher Nazis, who fled Germany at the end of the war and disappeared to South America.
But you shouldn't say more about it.
Of course not. Because of the Second World War, disc-shaped missiles were observed in Germany and even all over the world.
That corresponds to the circumstances, yes. These missiles, however, were not of earthly origin, but were our companions as well as our Federation allies.
So the observed flying discs had no reason whatsoever with the flying discs or flying gyroscopes of the Germans. Then other assertions are actually only stupid assertions of liars, phantoms, and know-it-alls, etc. We actually wanted to know that for a long time.
But that only refers to the flying gyroscopes of Schriever and Meier.
Were there any others?
There were, yes. These, however, were in private research, secretly conducted by power-hungry Nazis, using the plans of Schriever and Meier. These flying gyroscopes had already been further developed in Germany and were tested flights which yielded good results.
Today's South American group?
Your assumption is correct.
And all this could happen under the eyes of the Gestapo?
Many of the major Gestapo and SS leaders were involved and secretly working to keep the rest of the world ignorant of the constructions and test flights, etc., and when the end of the war came, they fled to South America with all their material and all their people. This was not a difficult undertaking for them, because the flying gyroscopes were already so airworthy that they could circumnavigate the Earth nonstop and transport away all materials and people before the Allied forces could seize them or find out anything about these secrets.
So that's how it happened. But how far has the construction of the Schriever and Meier flight gyro advanced?
On 15.7. 1941, the prototype was ready for the first test flight. We monitored this very closely. But the flying gyroscopes were not built after our transmissions. Because these had already been made unsuitable by us by false information, because we saw the great danger which would have resulted from it for the entire earthly mankind. However, we did nothing against the development of the Schriever and Meier flying gyroscopes until we realized that they suddenly posed a tremendous threat to humanity. Consequently, we interfered in the preparations for the first test flight just at the time when it was certain for us that the flight would be a complete success, and the mass production of the flying gyroscopes would entail, which would have meant that with the help of these flying machines, the entire earthly mankind would have been subjugated and enslaved, which, however, did not lie in their destiny and also in the future does not lie in their destiny. So we asked the Arahat Athersata plane what to do in this particular case, and then followed their advice to damage the project and completely destroy the flying gyroscopes and 3 other semi-finished specimens by transferring malfunctions into the machinery of the gyroscopes, destroying them in an explosive manner.
And why didn't you do that to those who later escaped to South America?
They meant no danger to the world and mankind, and they still don't do that today. They have, meanwhile, shrunk to a small group that has no more clout and is slowly dying out, because in the pure male world in which they live, no offspring are to be expected. Women and children are frowned upon, for they live solely by their technique and their desires for world domination, which, however, they are unable to realize. They live isolated for themselves, even if they often fly around the world with their flying discs, whereby they can also be observed here and there. They do not look for followers in the world outside either, because they are afraid that they might be betrayed by newcomers. As a result, they are completely closed off and have long since given up all attempts to find followers somewhere outside. All of them have also grown old since then, with the youngest now 78 years old. The whole group counts to today only 334 men of once more than 2,000 men. The rest have all died of illness or accidents, such as mistaken experiments or windshield crashes, or they have died quite normally.
Contact Report 259.
My assumption was correct, that the utilization of the plan, in regard to this flying device, found wider-ranging interest than that merely futuristic forms of container lids were manufactured from them, as I communicated to you at our conversation on 28.11. 1995. Our very extensive clarifications have revealed that the flying device plans were variously divided up and were used for further manufacturing. As, for example, for various forms of decoration and holding devices for various purposes. Also, exposed bolts for furniture shelves were created out of certain parts of the plans, as well as roller bearings from other parts of the plans. A flower pot base came about from another part of the plans, which, in its outer edge part, is very precisely configured in accord with the plan sketch. Consequently, therefore, even the surrounding pertinent special elements for the screening of the visibility of the flying body was carried over, and indeed so precisely and correctly that no difference exists between the plan sketches and the terrestrially created product. However, these are not the only terrestrially manufactured products from the flying device plans, because we could determine a total of 17 different objects for different purposes, which were worked out from the plans. We have gained no knowledge as to why that happened, if you exclude the fact that the flying device plans of that time were ripped out of their entirety and were distributed in several European countries as well as in America and Japan, where they found utilization for the planning and manufacturing of the most varied products which, in part, are still produced and utilized on Earth today.
Contact Report 265. Reader's question: Catalin Morescu, Germany, or what happens to the knowledge from the research and construction of the successor flight discs of the German South American group, which consists only of men, if one day the group no longer exists due to the death of its members? If these men live so far back and have no contact with other people outside their area, then they have no successors who could continue or end their experiments technical in nature. Will the Pleer and later eliminate these machines, or what happens to this legacy? One can only hope that this technology will not fall into the wrong hands. Can you make a statement about the technological lead compared to today's conventional drives? How great are the successes of this group in researching these alternative drives? Answer: Billy. Today, the South American group exists only as a small and closed community of old men who are decimated from year to year by their death and do not pose any danger to the world, not even with regard to their technology. The leading technical minds died a long time ago, the last of them about 15 years ago. The rest of the workforce was made up of auxiliaries and fanatical leaders who, in terms of technical developments, must be called zero forces. Even workers who were responsible for the maintenance of the technical equipment and aircraft etc. have not existed for quite some time. Which of course means that most of the equipment and aircraft have already been destroyed, so that in 1996 there were only 2 operational aircraft left, which at that time also had serious defects. Regarding the plans for the flying discs, it has to be said that these were already destroyed in the 60s by certain circumstances, about which I can give no information at all. As far as discarded aircraft are concerned, the following factors must be taken into account. Various flying discs were completely destroyed in crashes, to such an extent that no technical knowledge can be gained from them, should they ever be found. The reason for this total destruction was a self-destruct mechanism that is built into every flying disc even. The two that existed at least in the self-destruction was so effective that it completely shredded the flying disc and practically tore it apart when the self-ignition was triggered. The self-destruct mechanism has been an integral part of the flying disc since the beginning of its existence, very cleverly constructed and deadly safe. A flying disc could never and should never be left unattended, because otherwise it would automatically destroy itself. In this consequence, a guard always had to remain on board the aircraft in order to prevent the self-destruction of the flying screen. Because the self-destruction mechanism was constructed in such a way that no treason could be practiced and no escape could be made. Once the self-destruct mechanism had been activated, it could not and cannot be deactivated in such a way that the self-destruction of the flying disc could have been prevented. A prevention of the self-destruction was and is only possible for 60 minutes at a time, after which the self-destruction automatically starts, if not caused by a complicated sensor, which could only be or can only be influenced in a certain way, another 60 minutes delay. However, this meant and still means today, when the remaining two flying discs still exist, that day and night a guard person remains in the aircraft and has to calm down the self-destruct mechanism every hour and thus influence it. If this does not happen, the mechanism becomes active and can no longer be stopped, completely destroying and tearing apart the aircraft. This also eliminates the danger that is mentioned in the question of what happens to all technology, as a legacy, so to speak, when the last of the South American group blesses the temporal. The technique of self-destruction is certainly not new, but its nature and function are based on a high level of technical and electronic development. However, hardly anyone will notice this when the time comes, because the group's facilities are well camouflaged in previously unexplored areas of the jungle or rainforest. So there is no reason to fear that the technology of the group will fall into other hands.
Your explanation is appropriate. It has to be said, however, that of all flying discs, only one is left, which, however, already has flight-inhibiting defects and will probably be destroyed within the next few months.
Contact Report 452.
Then, that now is finally clear. The connections with the Giza honchos and other extraterrestrials are therefore much trickier and more extensive, as you told me. But even so, I also have never asked about it. Consequently, you also have told me nothing about the details. Then, however, I have a problem again, and in fact, with the extraterrestrial aircraft that the Brazilian group had, from which I was set about in the year 1976 in Winkelried, near Wetzikon. You told me at that time, which unfortunately was not recorded in any contact report, that it concerned a beam ship, which indeed was piloted by people from a distant galaxy, and in fact with poison gas breathers or such, that they, however, were members of your Federation, if I am not mistaken. With the 65th contact on the 23rd of October 1976, you said the following.
Further also, I was able to clarify the events in the Winkelried near Wetzikon near your domicile. So in addition, also the existence of that track of a beam ship, which was not from one of our beam ships. With the track discovered by you, it concerns a ship of the Brazilian Private Interest Group, who had sent out a command for the most exact probe of your circumstances. In accordance with my investigations, it was about 5 people who checked everything very accurately. The ship doesn't even represent a product of the power group itself, but loot. It was stolen from a crew from a distant galaxy who landed in Brazil years ago, who had to make a forced landing because of some damage. The interstellar drive of the ship was completely destroyed and cannot be repaired again, at least not by the technicians of this power group. Only the planetary anti-gravity drive is fully functional, which is suffice for planetary flights. However, you saw the same ship weeks later in the Winkel riot, where you on your very irrational search for this, for you, mysterious object, also discovered this, which put you very much in danger. 2 men were in the terrain out there and observed your arrival, which was an easy game for them because at the time they observed you constantly. In the desire to kill you, they prepared everything and steered you to the place of the planned event. It was your luck that you drove in your vehicle with caution and without lights on that dark night, because it was only through this that you were not exactly recognizable in the darkness that the shot from the gun missed you. Unfortunately, you are mistaken, dear friend, because the strangers were not members of our Federation, but they belonged to another group of the Giza intelligences, and were stationed also with these, whereby they had to make an emergency landing in Brazil at that time and were captured by the Brazilian group. Actually, they were poison gas breathers who all died when their respiration equipment failed. They could not leave the Earth anymore, because their interstellar drive was completely destroyed, which was a work of the Giza intelligences, as we found by experience through the members of the Syrian group. The reason for the destruction of the drive was so that they could not flee, because the Giza intelligences had a change in fundamental attitude.
And the Giza twerps didn't undertake anything, as the ship had to make an emergency landing in Brazil, and the respiration equipment failed, so also nothing, since the old Nazis of the Brazilian group captured the ship.
Their nature and behavior was that they simply gave up lost aircraft, as also they were not concerned about missing people, etc. either. Furthermore, they were on close terms with the Brazilian group, which, however, that already for a long time does not exist anymore, because every one of the faction has died by now because of aging and illness.
All members of this group were former officers of the German Empire who escaped from Germany to Brazil. They were mainly leading lights and henchmen of the Nazi Empire, and therefore escaped war criminals.
This was actually the case.
Contact Report 510.
Something else. Many of the great Nazis fled to Argentina at the end of the Second World War, and they also took secret plans of flying discs with them. Then it happened, as happened at Area 51, that suddenly many different unknown flying objects were sighted over the country, called UFOs. In Argentina, it was the German Nazi engineers and Nazi greats who had fled, and at Area 51 it was the German Nazi engineers who had been captured by the USA and enlisted to build flying discs and rockets, etc., for which these Nazis had their past simply erased and were granted American citizenship. The question: there are still various reports of UFOs in areas of Mexico and Argentina and elsewhere in South America, as well as in the USA. What is to be thought of? Do old Nazi engineers still work in Argentina? And are strange flying apparatus still being worked on in Area 51, which are then observed as UFOs?
For a number of years now, we have not made any special efforts to deal with these things because they are no longer of any importance to us, so we only deal with them sporadically. Our findings, however, are that there is always something to be found in relation to so-called UFO observations. It is true that with regard to such observations, which are made from time to time all over the world, today not as many unknown objects are observed as in the past from Area 51 and from Argentina, etc., and also not with regard to our and our allies' flying apparatus, but they still appear sporadically. The main phase of alien terrestrial missile development is over, for its main period was during the Second World War and then during the so-called Cold War.
Contact Report 511.
The film sequences were black and white shots that looked as if they really came from the 40s or 50s. In my opinion, it is very possible that the various flying apparatuses shown are original shots, showing flying apparatuses that really flew through the air and were classified by observers as extraterrestrial UFOs. This is precisely because, due to the nationwide military secrecy, they had no idea that these were secret terrestrial developments of futuristic flying apparatus. The same was the case in Argentina and elsewhere in South America, except that at the end of the Second World War, Nazi engineers who had fled Germany realized their plans for futuristic flying apparatus, which then flew through the air as UFOs and still do so here and there, as in the USA and elsewhere.
What I can say is that the black and white film sequences you mentioned really do correspond to original footage and show secret U.S. flying apparatus that was further developed according to Nazi plans. This also involved Nazi engineers who were acquitted of their Nazi past in the USA and became American citizens. These, like the Nazi engineers who had fled to South America, also continued to work on the development of disc, bell, and balloon-shaped flying apparatus, which were airworthy and with which extensive test flights were carried out. This could be kept secret until today, apart from the fact that the flying apparatuses were seen by many people from the population who classified the whole thing as extraterrestrial flying apparatuses, respectively, as UFOs. However, the further development of such secret flying apparatus has not been discontinued, neither in the United States, nor in various places in South America, nor in other countries. Consequently, test flights are still being carried out with such apparatus today, not only over the production areas, but also in the airspace around the planet. And as it must be, these flying apparatuses are judged by observers around the world to be extraterrestrial UFOs, as has always been the case. This is not least because the U.S. Secret Services and the U.S. Air Force, as well as those in charge of Area 51, have been secretly fueling UFO mania among the population through all kinds of machinations in order to conceal the truth of the experimental flying apparatus. The so-called Cold War was a very special factor, which is why everything was handled in great secrecy, and this has remained so to this day, even if the whole thing was interrupted by the end of the break in text of Cold Warfare has diminished, so the great boom in test flights with secret futuristic flying apparatus is over. This does not mean that such flying apparatuses would not continue to be further developed and tested with secret test flights, because this is actually the case in various places, and therefore such objects can still be observed as UFOs, although no longer to the same extent as was the case in the past. Most of these test flights are still carried out in the USA and at various locations in South America. With regard to such flying apparatus, even today a secret further development is still underway, which is why the USA is also still trying to portray the Roswell case as an illusion and as an accident with a balloon apparatus. This, in order not to have to admit that they gained important technical knowledge from the crashed object, which they have been evaluating since then, in combination with the plan documents they have from the Nazi flying discs and Nazi flying bells they acquired in Germany at the end of the war. And the fact that German Nazi engineers worked with U.S. scientists, engineers and technicians after the end of World War II on all the secret flying discs and bells and on rocket construction, as was also the case in the USSR, should also remain secret.
Contact Report 533.
That group in South America, which emerged from fugitive Nazi engineers, which built flying discs in Germany and then later in the USA and in South Africa. I knew about that, but is there anything special about it? In particular, whether such flying discs are still being produced today, and whether they still fly around the world.
None of this has changed. Not even the fact that certain states continue to work within the same framework, and that the Nazi flying apparatus technology captured by the war victors continues to be worked on, as do many descendants of Nazi engineers who have been trained as engineers and who can also work on Nazi techniques relating to flying discs, etc., and show good results.
Mainly in South America, but probably not only in one country, right?
That is correct.
Contact Report 565.
But the UFOs, the so-called Foo Fighters, which were observed during the Second World War, were they secret earthly flying machines?
No. We were also able to clarify this. All of them were members of the four groups unknown to us, whose flying apparatus we are also unable to penetrate today with our latest analysis apparatus and equipment. Not. Here there seems to be the clarification that actual Foo Fighters, spacecraft originating from the four groups, extraterrestrials, resident extraterrestrials, and future Earth humanity, are different from the secret Nazi aircraft technology, also popularly referred to as Foo Fighters.
Contact Report 672 20th Century Reichsflaggschibe. The Third Reich had been in possession of a futuristic aircraft. True, the Nazi Empire developed disc-flying apparatuses, which were about 2,000 kilometers per hour fast and reached over 12,500 meters altitude. However, these flying discs were single-wing aircraft, which were of a completely different type than normal wing aircraft.